So maybe it's time trying to start. I wait until we are 100 on board of the 230. Well, I wish to welcome you all on behalf of the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock and its Action Network Livestock Antimicrobial Partnership called LAMP, that is hosted by SLU, Swedish University of Agriculture Sciences, who is also hosting that network. My name is Ulf Magnusson. I'm a professor at the Department of Clinical Sciences here at SLU, and I'm also the coordinator of the LAMP network. And I'm also affiliated to the SLU Global, who is hosting the network. As we all know, antimicrobials is a fantastic asset, both for human medicine and veterinary medicine. However, and unfortunately, the more we use antibiotics or antimicrobials, the higher is the risk that the bugs that we are trying to fight are developing resistance to these antibiotics. So the trick is to be as restrictive as possible when using the antibiotics to protect their efficacy. Just using them when it's really needed, not for growth promotion or other kind of regular use. That is what we call medical rational use. So you might wonder why this economic/geographic limitation of this webinar, low-income countries. The anti-AMR campaigns and also research often originates or is driven by OECD countries. And sometimes one may think, or at least some of us think, that it's not particularly informed. Not strong words like naive or ignorant, but not informed enough about the different conditions in low-income countries or lower middle-income countries, by the way. It's about the access to antibiotics. It's about maybe different incentives for using antibiotics, the regulatory frameworks, and also the resources to enforce these regulations. So here today we will discuss these aspects, both from policy sides and on the in the field, so to say. So if I can have next slide, please. The program here is, you see, we have a very distinguished groups of speakers. We will have first we will have three from World Bank, ILRI, and Vétérinaires Sans Frontières. And then we will have a 15 minutes panel discussion and then a convenience break for 5 minutes. And then we will have three speakers from World Organization for Animal Health, OIE, from the FAO, and also from SLU. And following that by a panel discussion. So we hope that we will contribute, after this seminar, have contributed to a more informed discussion and allowing us to refine our doings towards a more rational use of antibiotics in the low-income countries. But just before we starting, I want to show you some housekeeping protocol here. This webinar will be recorded and posted online on this web address, slu.se/lamp. You will find it there. And you're welcome to post questions to the speakers by using Q&A function in the Zoom. And you find that button on the right on the bottom of the Zoom window, so to say, on the right. And we will really aim to handle all questions, but we cannot guarantee this. The chat will be open to everyone during the meeting, so you can communicate there with your friends or others. But we will not be able to respond to the questions and there or intervene by other means. So we leave that by you. So now I have the privilege to present the first speaker. It's not Emily, it's Frank Berthe. Frank is a senior livestock specialist at the World Bank and a One Health practitioner working across agriculture, environment, and public health sectors. And he has also co-authored or co-signed two well-known World Bank publications on AMR. One is the drug-resistant infections, a threat to our economic future in 2016, and the other is pulling together to beat superbugs, knowledge and implementation gaps in addressing antimicrobial resistance. And that one came out 2019. So please, Frank, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Ulf, for organizing this webinar, and thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be with you and somehow reconnect with the AMR community. I think those last months have been absorbed by COVID-19, and sometimes I must confess we've had the tendency to put AMR on the back burner. So it's good that we refresh our networks, our understandings, and our actions, hopefully. So I will take you to the economic route to antimicrobial resistance, a bit the way we sometimes propose a scenic road or a scenic route to a destination. Economics is not often the first thing you think about when you think about AMR. But I believe this is important, and sitting in the World Bank, of course, surrounded by so many brilliant economists, I came to the point that I believe this is key to our capacity to move the needle on AMR. Next slide, please. So just few facts on how we see AMR, and basically we would flip the coin and look at antimicrobial effectiveness. This effectiveness, as Ulf mentioned during the introduction, is a finite resource and valuable asset for the world, saving hundreds of millions of lives. We could put a dollar value between 20 and 54 US dollar trillion, and it's critical to human capital. But this free or weakly regulated market has resulted in a sort of first come, first served allocation, which is now posing some problems. Another point is that more antimicrobials and certainly antibiotics are used in agriculture compared to humans. I think it's 2/3 of the antibiotics used in agriculture, with some external negative externalities. And so this sets back major development and economic gains that we've had over the past few decades, and we will speak about the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. So in short, or in summary, containment of AMR is definitely a global public good. Next slide, please. So where are we coming from before we embark on this economic road? Over the past few years, we've had some key reports published by WHO, the Tripartite, the World Health Assembly, Probably the groundbreaking report has been the 2016 O'Neill review on antimicrobial resistance, with first big figures on the impact, public health impact, and economic impact of AMR, followed shortly by our World Bank reports on the economic future in relation to AMR. So this is what I will use as a basis for my presentation today. Next slide. So first is this figure to show that we've quantified the projected impact of unchecked AMR spread on the global GDP. And basically using the general equilibrium model of the world economy, we've done three scenarios. One is what we call the base, where AMR containment would be fully achieved. Let's say it's a theoretical situation at this stage. A low AMR scenario where the AMR containment would substantially be achieved, or AMR would be less than predicted by science and observed trends, such as the O'Neill report, and a high AMR scenario where there would be no containment of the issue. And in a high AMR impact scenario, basically the world would lose 3.8% of its annual GDP, the gross domestic product, by 2050, with an annual shortfall of 3.4 trillion by 2030. And even if AMR impacts are relatively mild, they would likely to reduce the annual GDP by 1.1% by 2050, and the GDP shortfall would probably exceed 1 trillion annually after 2030. So in other words, the annual reduction of this global GDP could be as large as the losses provoked by the 2008 global financial crisis. However, there are two main differences between this financial crisis and AMR. One is that the impact of the AMR crisis would be felt through the entire period to 2050, and not just a couple of very bad years, as it was in the case of 2008. Next slide. The second difference between this financial crisis and what would be an AMR crisis, or what is an AMR crisis, is that the impact on GDP would be worse than those of this 2008 crisis. But more importantly, it's the low-income countries that would experience larger drops in economic growth than compared to the wealthy countries. So the global poverty and the economic inequality in the world would increase. So the poorest people and the poorest countries would be more affected by AMR. Overall, we estimated that AMR could push an additional 20.3 million people into extreme poverty by 2050. And that is predominantly in low and middle income countries. Next slide, please. I think that what is an important economic figure is that the one on the return on investment. The cost of AMR containment in low and middle income countries is estimated to approximately $9 billion US dollars annually through the entire period to 2050. Without this spending, the containment will not occur, and AMR will impose large costs in all countries. We've seen that. The expected cost without AMR containment, so in a low AMR scenario, is estimated between 10 and 27 trillion accumulated over the period 2017-2050. This is 100 times greater than the required containment costs. Okay, so this annual rate of return for this investment could reach up to 88% per year if 75% of AMR's negative effects are avoided. So it is an exceptional economic investment for countries, and very seldom you would see such high returns on investments. So we need to see AMR as an investment opportunity. Next slide, please. So different countries stand to benefit from AMR control in different ways, and that's another lesson from our assessments. High income and upper middle income countries stand to benefit the most from AMR containment, both in absolute and per capita terms. So low-income countries will see substantial economic payoff relative to the size of their economies. However, the largest absolute and per capita gains will actually flow to upper middle income and high-income countries. 82% of the benefits are as it's shown on the figure. So assuming very conservatively that only 10% of the model costs were averted through AMR containment measures, high-income countries would still obtain benefits of 0.9 trillion and 2.7 trillion in the low AMR impact scenario and the high impact scenario, respectively. This is 4 times and 13 times, 1-3, more than the global investment cost of 0.2 trillion. So there again, I mean, this investment in AMR containment is a no-brainer, and including for high-income and upper middle-income countries, supporting lower-income countries in making these investments is absolutely obvious. Next slide, please. What we've seen from this original economic assessment is that, in fact, things are going far beyond what we had considered originally. And AMR is indeed a sustainable development challenge. AMR needs to be reframed as a global development issue, and it cannot be solved just by technical solutions alone. And AMR-sensitive interventions are often the most cost-effective way, especially in low middle-income countries, to overcome the underlying weaknesses in establishing an enabling environment for successful reduction of unnecessary use and over-reliance on antimicrobials. So the new way of thinking AMR is with this distinction between AMR-specific interventions and AMR-sensitive interventions. AMR-specific interventions have their main purpose to reduce AMR. The primary purpose of AMR-sensitive interventions is probably not AMR control, but it can be designed and delivered in such a way that they would contribute indirectly to combating AMR. And you can see in this figure that the pursuit of at least 12 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, would help combating AMR. So we're sitting on a gold mine of what we call co-benefits on AMR. Next slide, please. So the use of antimicrobials has been a main focus in national action plans on AMR, and rightly so, because imprudent and irresponsible use of antimicrobials fueled the emergence of resistance. But this emergence is probably one first component of the AMR problem. And the second component is probably spread. So focusing on controlling emergence and resistance by improving governance and reducing misuse of antimicrobials is absolutely needed, but it's not enough for controlling the spread of AMR. Next slide, please. We need also to improve the systems, and I'm nearly finished.
Yeah, great.
Okay. We need also to improve the systems and infrastructures in order to address this second component of the spread of AMR. And so this is where there is such an important point on AMR sensitive interventions. Next slide, just to show that looking at the risk profile, we can define roughly 4 types of countries with different levels of risk and different profiles of risks. Next slide. I'll pass this very quickly, but the returns of AMR sensitive interventions are really highest in low and middle income countries that belong to the type A and type B countries essentially. Next slide, to show you how we put that in practice. And the current net commitment of IDA-IBRD, the World Bank, amounts about 241 billion in about 1,500 investments projects in low and middle income countries. And agriculture, water and health, nutrition account for approximately 25% of this portfolio. Few examples maybe to illustrate how in those investments we harness AMR sensitive and AMR specific, but more importantly, AMR sensitive interventions. And the one on the bottom right is the PRAPS, a regional project in the Sahel region for pastoralism, where we invest 248 million in 6 countries of the region, with a strong animal health component that is by itself 25% of the investment. And part of this is to test and scale up solutions to improve the quality of veterinary medicines and substandard or falsified medicinal products. So this is an example. I could run many other examples, but because of the time constraint, I will leave you with this slide and a few examples where we can gain on AMR. With this, I will stop. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Frank. We will come back to you in some 30 minutes and during the discussion. And I want to also encourage those of you who arrived a little bit late that please use the Q&A function for questions, and we will take on them later in the discussion. So now it's time for my dear colleague Arshni Moodley. She's the leader of the CGIAR Antimicrobial Resistance Hub in the CGIAR system, again in Nairobi in Kenya, and she's also associate professor at the Department of Veterinary and Animal Sciences in University of Copenhagen, and she has worked some 15 years on AMR in food producing and companion animals, as well as zoonotic aspects on this. So please, Arshni, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ulf, for the invitation to be here, and also good afternoon from Nairobi, Kenya. Just wait for my slides. Yes. So as Ulf said, my name is Arshni Moodley, and next slide, please. And I lead the CGIAR Antimicrobial Resistance Hub. And if you don't know anything about the CGIAR, it's a global research network that's focused on reducing poverty and food insecurity through sustainable agriculture. And so the CGI AMR Hub was launched in February 2019, focused on addressing the AMR challenges associated with antimicrobial use in agriculture in the global south. And this is basically built upon the 5 pillars that you see in front of you to generate evidence in low and middle income countries, as well as engaging with policymakers and building the capacity here. And this is really a unique place where we convene all our partners from within the CG and also international and national partners to address AMR in a multi-sectorial approach. Next slide, please. And this is just a very short sort of overview of the different countries where we have AMR activities ongoing, and there are different activities in the different countries. Next slide, please. So I was asked to give a talk about accessibility of primarily antibiotics in low-income countries. And yeah, I could just show you one slide of all the different places a person can go to buy antibiotics. But I think antibiotics, the access to them is very much or intimately linked to why are antibiotics needed, as well as herd health and various other sort of aspects related to that. So one of the first questions we could ask ourselves is, why do farmers need antibiotics? Why do they go about seeking the access of that? And that is either for a therapeutic or a non-therapeutic use. And Frank just showed you a few numbers about how much of non-therapeutic use, and also Ulf pointed out that this is probably leading or exacerbating the AMR problem that we have. The other issue is about factors related to availability of an antibiotic. So what antibiotics are actually available in a country. Also about all the things related to why does an animal need antibiotics and how do you go about determining treatment? Where can a farmer buy these antibiotics, and then who administers that? So we're going to tackle a little bit of these questions in the next slides. Next slide, please. So when we think about how do we get antibiotics, a lot of us just go down to our pharmacy and get it. But really, there's a long global antibiotic supply chain that needs to happen before we can even purchase it. And there are very few countries that actually produce antibiotics, and typically antibiotics are imported by a national procurement agency, private organizations, or NGOs. And this is in low and middle income countries. And this is very much dependent on what is globally available. There are very few companies that actually manufacture antibiotics. And if anything happens that disrupts a particular node in this big supply chain, will pretty much halt the availability of certain antibiotics in a specific region, or even globally. The other thing that will affect what antibiotics are actually available in the country is local import regulations. And countries have very complex regulations that govern that. And this often, because it's so complex, leads to shortcuts. The other thing is that at the national level, once we're in a country, there will be differences in what is available. And particularly, I'm thinking about the different regions. So for example, in a rural community, you may have very limited types of antibiotics versus an urban setting like a capital city like Nairobi. The other factor that influences availability is the price of a drug. Basically, it's an investment, a financial investment that a drugstore owner will make to procure antibiotics. And typically the person that is buying antibiotics, also the price of the antibiotics plays a major role in that. And then above all of this is compounded by illegal entry of drugs, as well as those that are smuggled in. So it's a very complex, intricate network. So it's very difficult to know exactly how much antibiotics are actually entering the country and then how much is actually used on the ground. Next slide, please. The other thing, as also Frank alluded to in his presentation, is the quality. So in Frank's presentation, he said 60%. I took this from a WHO report. They said at least 17%, which is a lot lower than Frank's, but Frank's is probably newer, of antibiotics in low and middle income country are substandard and counterfeit. And there are many, many factors that can lead or contribute to that these type of drugs are entering the market. As I said, we have some very complex regulations here that is sometimes very difficult to follow, and therefore you have maneuvering of it. We also have corruption. So officials are corrupt and can be bought to allow certain drugs to come in. And also the sort of the agency or the governing body that regulates importation of the drug is also not the same body that will then administer the use of the drug. So, and there's very difficult, a little or poor communication between the different ministries or factions within the government that are regulating this. And lastly, you have very weak enforcement of the regulations, which then also contribute to the infiltration of poor quality drugs into the country. The other thing, I've read some reports in which manufacturers produce low quality products for less regulated markets. So for example, because in low and middle income countries, they lack the sort of infrastructure or the capability to conduct or to assess the quality of drugs. And therefore, because it's that together with the less regulations, then you have these sort of poor quality drugs also coming in. Now, once the drugs land in the country, there are other issues that can affect the quality. For example, if antibiotics have to be transported over a very long distance and there's not sufficient cold storage or sort of a way of transporting that assures the quality is maintained. So for a good example is cold storage. Electricity, this requires electricity. And if you know anything about living in even here in Nairobi, is that we sometimes have power outages, which make it very difficult to sustain a cold storage unless you have some sort of backup. Other things that complicate the quality is that because of a very complex distribution network within the country, it's very difficult to do recalls. There's no infrastructure for recalls if a sort of poor quality drug is detected. The other thing, as I said, is that people who, so retailers, they make a financial investment to procure these drugs. And when the drugs are expired, there's no compensation for the retailer. And because it's so closely linked to his profits or rather his livelihood, he tends to continue to sell these expired drugs. Next slide, please. So how are farms treated? And I tried to create two scenarios here, one from my adoptive country, Denmark, and the other one from the country in which I'm now living here in Kenya. And this is really to give you an idea of the sort of all the things that go into from the time an animal is sick to the time that that animal gets antibiotics. And that then leads you to understand a little bit about the access. Next slide, please. So this is the Danish model. So if an animal is sick, there are very few pathways in which that animal will be able to get an antibiotic treatment. And this is mainly for production animals. And it's basically the very first sort of distinction is whether that farmer or not has a herd health contract with a veterinarian. In Denmark, the only person that can make a diagnosis of an animal is a veterinarian. And therefore, he's the one that will prescribe the antibiotic. And there are only very few instances where the farmer is allowed to administer the antibiotic. Otherwise, it is the veterinarian that will do the administration. And this is just the very sort of strict pathways that we have in Denmark to regulate use of antimicrobials in animals. The other thing is that there are a number of other sort of initiatives to also regulate usage. The one thing is that veterinarians are not allowed to have to make profit. In fact, it's capped. They can only add a maximum 10% on the resale of antibiotics to farmers, and this is really to compensate losses. The other sort of initiatives in place is that if you want to do flock treatment, you have to have a laboratory diagnosis in order to ensure that the correct treatment is being administered. Moreover, there's the cascade rule, there's differential taxation on different antibiotics. There's also the surveillance program and the yellow card scheme, which all together sort of regulates and monitors antimicrobial usage in Denmark. Next slide, please. And now if we have to hop on a plane and come to a country like Kenya or Uganda or any other sort of low middle income setting, there are multiple pathways in which once an animal is sick to that time that animal gets an antibiotic treatment. And there are so many factors that will influence the different decisions being made. So for example, ideally, the best pathway would be the green pathway, where you have the farmer calling a veterinarian. But for the farmer to call a veterinarian, there are a number of things that will influence that decision. For example, typically a farmer will call a veterinarian only if it's very severe symptoms or the animal is about to die. And it's also if it's beyond his own experience or that of his neighbors. So he will then call a veterinarian. The other thing that will determine whether he calls a veterinarian or not is the value of the animal. So for example, a cow may be more valuable than, say, a chicken. The other thing that will also influence that is how much money. A veterinarian, to have a veterinarian visit your farm is extremely expensive. Not only will the farmer have to pay for the consultation, he also has to pay for the transport. And then on top of that, he has to pay for the drugs. And smallholder farmers in low and middle income countries do not have a lot of money. Their economy is extremely precarious, and therefore they don't have these outputs to spend on a veterinarian's call to their farm. The other thing is that we have some data that suggests that, depending on a study, up to 80% of farmers will self-diagnose based on his or her experience. And then he or she would go to an agrovet or a kiosk of various places where he can access the drug and purchase it for them. Very often there's very little back checking at the pharmacy or agrovet as to whether or not he's able to, if indeed this is the condition and this is the right antibiotic to be using. We also have data that shows that anywhere between 30 to almost 100% of the sales of antimicrobials in low and middle income countries is without a prescription. And this is despite there being regulations prohibiting sale of antibiotics without a prescription. But there simply is just no mechanism in place in order to monitor the compliance with this particular regulation. And so this is just really to give you a flavor of the different pathways and sort of the different places that a farmer can access an antibiotic, and that despite there being regulations, it's very difficult to implement at the ground. Very often in rural communities, a veterinarian is probably not available. There's very few veterinarians in these sort of communities, and therefore the farmer has to either rely upon himself, that of a friend, or he will go to this agrovet to get advice. Next slide, please. So this is probably the money slide that I was asked to present of accessibility to antibiotics. So where does a farmer buy his antibiotics? And I've tried to separate between a formal sector and an informal sector. And formal by the sense that there are policies regulating these particular establishments. But whether the policies are actually implemented is a completely different story. So for example, in the formal sector will be the pharmacy, and this would typically sell antibiotics for human consumption. And then you would have drug stores, which will typically send veterinary drugs. The agrovet is an interesting shop. It's basically a one-stop agricultural shop, and they tend to specialize both in crop production and as well as livestock production. And this shop could sell different things from feed to fertilizers, seeds, as well as veterinary supplies, including antibiotics and vaccines. Typically, this is one of the places in which a farmer will go to ask advice. And while the regulation says that a person that has this shop has to have a license, has to be licensed with the government and have some sort of education associated with animal health. But typically what we find is that these agrovets they tend to hire people who are not necessarily qualified and tend to give advice, but still giving advice to the farmer based on the farmer's recounting of the symptoms. And then another formalized sector is then these animal health practitioners, which could be veterinarians or these extension officers that are employed by the government. And the next we have is the informal sector. And really one of the important things about the informal sector is that they tend to fill a gap that the formal sector cannot fill. And this is primarily in areas in which you don't have access to large shops or establishments and in less regulated communities. And this could be a local kiosk or store that simply just sells different drugs for human or animal consumption. This could be an open market, like the picture I have on the right, showing where drugs are really are sold, and you just come by and ask for the drug you want. You can have pharmaceutical reps that visit your farm and sort of give you antibiotics. You can also acquire your drugs from your neighbors if they have any leftovers. And then the other thing is unqualified practitioners who often give advice at a much cheaper rate than a veterinarian would, as well as also offering drugs, which typically would be these low quality drugs at a cheaper price. And this is very important to understand that the farmer, the smallholder farmer, he simply doesn't have the fluidity or flexibility in his income in order to make, he does what he thinks is the best decision. And sometimes the best decision tend to be governed by how much he can afford. So this includes, sometimes he would buy a very small dose of the antibiotic to use because he cannot afford the full dose or the full treatment. Next slide, please. And that's really the end of my talk. And I've been sitting here telling you a lot about the research that has been done on the backs of other people. And this is typically Michelle Dioni and Barbara and Ulf, who have been leading the big research programs within the CGR, mainly the livestock CRP, as well as agriculture for nutrition. And the projects at the bottom are the future projects that will be building on the legacy of all the work that has come from these research problems. So I want to say thank you, and thank you for listening to me. Bye.
Thank you so much, Ashni. That was a reality check on the ground. That is a fantastic image you showed at the end. I use that myself sometimes. And please use the Q&A. And there was one question I saw in the Q&A. I can take that immediately, whether the presentations will be available after on the website after the webinar. We will check whether that will be possible or not, but for sure the webinar as such is recorded, so you can look into it later on. So thank you again, Ashni, for excellent presentation. Next presentation is from Dr. Marta Kariminati, based in Niger. No, Nigeria.
No, Niger.
Niger. Sorry.
No problem.
Bad glasses. She is the country representative there for the Vétérinaires Sans Frontières International, and she is also a country director of the Accra Foundation, and she is heavily involved in rural development in general. So please, Marta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ulf, and thank you very much for the colleagues who precede me, because I'm very happy to confirm that all the context that we already said, I'm finding myself as well on the ground here in West Africa. So I'm waiting for the presentation. So here we are, West Africa past and present challenges. Why about this? Because I was thinking about these aspects in my routine. I'm speaking from the field, so I'm not at the lab every day, and sometimes do you want more information, and now I'm happy to be the part of this team, because I can also reach some labs and some information to verify what I'm doing in the field. So as a representative of Veterinarians Without Borders Italy, I have also to present the network, because we are 12 organizations, non-profit organizations coming from all over the world, but mainly from Europe. And there's also Canada who is with us. We have the main objective to create a world where we have healthy animals, and so we can lead to healthy people conditions. And our mission is to reduce poverty, obviously, to reduce or to sustain food security by sustaining local farmers, but also local vets. Because as we said before, sometimes the problem in these countries is that we don't have enough people working in these sectors. So it's difficult to reach the results that we want. We can pass to the other slide, please. Working in the field, we also have some other partners. We are not just the VSF family. I don't see the next slide. Please, thank you very much. So we are working together, each member of the family, Switzerland, France, Italy, mainly West Africa, but we are also connected with other partners. And I want to say, for example, thank you for the École Inter-État des Sciences et Médecine Vétérinaire de Dakar, because we don't have enough vets to cover this area. So nowadays they are one of the best schools in West Africa to form our colleagues. And in the field, we find a lot as well of animal health workers, which are not coming from university studies. So we are really happy to have joined these cooperation and to be signing this agreement, because we can improve also the scholarship of other students in the future. We are also part, obviously, of the global agenda for sustainable livestock, so it's not our first presentation here. And we are taking part to some groups, agricultural groups, and also livestock sustainable groups, like the Global Food Security Cluster of FAO. Thank you. For the next slide. Maybe it's a little bit late because of my network. I don't know. Okay. So what is our approach? We are working together to reach the One Health approach in the field. We have different projects in different areas, but basically we are more in the north of Africa, in West Africa, central part of Africa, and lately, as they said, Italy, we are also in Peru. We are running different projects about food security, pastoralism, small farming, animal health, zoonosis, but the basic that is our also forever mission is healthy animal, healthy people, healthy environment. So we have also, for example, we have staff friends who are running their activities close to agriculture sector and not all based on the veterinary one. Thank you. Next slide, please. Why all this information about who we are? Because it's important to say that we have different expertise, but on the field, we are always working with our colleagues who studied in Africa or abroad, but we don't forget that they are the core value of our research in the field. So this participative and health risk appraisal approach that we are always utilizing on the field is the core base of our actions. So we have a lot of friends, a lot of vets that they are with me as well. And I can say also in my day-to-day life. And we have daily interaction with our participative epidemiology. Why this? Because in these countries, for example, in Mauritania, Senegal, and Niger, where I've worked, we don't have enough labs to support these researches. So we have to do participative like research and approach in order to take the information from the field from other vets, like you can see Dr. Ama in the left side, or all the veterinary technicians that now we say community animal health workers, which are the core center of some regions, because we don't need to say more that vets are not enough, and so they are covering some areas on the field. Thank you. For the next slide. So also in the researches on AMR, we are speaking with breeders. This is my favorite part of the job, for sure. It's the more difficult one because we have to interface difficult grounds, difficult people, difficult situation in West Africa, mainly because of terrorism. But people are wonderful, and breeders are putting themselves really, really hard to ameliorate their conditions. So by studying in Mauritania, Senegal, and Niger, and speaking with these breeders, I found that they have some basic and mainly issues that some of my colleagues previously already said. And so when I spoke last time with this guy on the left side in Niamey, was February, and last time with this small guy who is a pearl breeder in Senegal, I had the same conclusion. So different contexts and countries, but at the end, the same problem. Next slide, please. We can resume the common diseases that they declare, because when we speak with vets and also with breeders, we are asking which are the main issues, which are the main technical issues, but we also studying on the field by see the clinical sign with them, using pictures, using sign on other animals. And so we reach the point where in this area, the main diseases are PPR, foot and mouth disease, pasteurellosis, scabies, and then I also said about internal and external parasitosis because of the seasonality, we can also have in the humid season, so in the rainy season, a lot of parasites. As we mentioned before, there are two types of treatments, basically, two routes that breeders and vets and technical people are taking, which are local and natural remedies or modern pharmacology. See that we are speaking more about modern pharmacology at the moment. I'm seeing that much every day, especially here in Asia. Oxytetracycline, used at 5%, 10%, 20%. Also long-acting molecules, that much. Also third generation cephalosporin, also coming from the human sector. So they are not just using veterinary drugs, but they are also using the human ones in case they find them. And I also mentioned ivermectin and albendazole because of the internal and external parasitosis. We can pass to the next slide, please.
Can you speed up, Marta?
Yes. So by resuming, okay, we are nearly there. All the situation that we are facing in the everyday life, I wanted to resume some aspects that are basically important in our veterinary life here. So breeders are taking some actions because they don't have the veterinary system in place, or they are too far, or they are in the desert. So the bad habits, if we can say, are improper or absent diagnosis because they cannot reach the vet, no veterinary consultation and DIY treatments, improper dosage of antibiotics, rare attention about the respect and the temperature and use by date because they are living still in the desert. So they are taking their drugs in their bags while traveling with the animals. Products sold and bought on the local market, and also incomplete therapies because, as Arshni said, it's more because they don't have enough money or because they cannot reach the vet every week to do the treatment. Next slide, please. So here is just some pictures going to the end of the presentation, see some situation of bad transportation, because as you can see on the left, it's Mauritania. It's a train in the north of Mauritania, and they are transporting animals and also drugs on the train. So you can imagine how temperature can affect the drugs. And also, as we saw before, seller in the market, in the local market. Next slide, nearly there. Thank you very much. Okay, still not there, but I just wanted to put the attention on the fact that, okay, we are fighting, if we want to say, against local traditional methods, even if they are sometimes effective, and also some research said that they are okay for animals. But we have to think as well as veterinarians that we have to improve local condition of animals, of nutrition, before also thinking of the use of antibiotics, because if animals are in good health and in a good environment as well, we don't need to use that much antibiotics. So thank you very much, and I'll leave you the word. If you can put to the last slide as well.
Thank you so much, Marta, for this colorful presentation and very on the ground thing. Now it's time for a brief discussion. We have some 15 minutes for that. We're a little bit behind schedule. So Frank and Arshni is here, and also Sandra, I hope. And Sandra, the first question, please. And
Yes.
respond as precise as you can for the sake of time. Sandra?
Yes, the first question is for Frank, and I've seen that you already answered this one in text, but I think it could be interesting for everyone to hear this. Hi, Frank. Thank you for an interesting presentation. And this question is from Nawar Al-Ebadi at SIDA. My question concerns the required capital investments into AMR containment. You mentioned that this should be of highest priority among public sector investments, but what about private sector investments? Do you know any work that aims to mobilize private financing towards AMR containment?
Yeah, no, I think it would be a mistake to see AMR as only being a responsibility for public sector. It's a shared responsibility, and so the private sector has an important role to play. It's sometimes difficult to distinguish what's public, what's private when it comes to agriculture and food. Farmers are private entrepreneurs. An example I was giving in the chat is what we've done in Vietnam, trying to support the livestock sector and promoting the adoption of good animal health, good animal husbandry practices, what we call the GAPs. And this is where the government and the farmers and the cooperatives work together. So that on the ground we promote prudent and responsible use of antimicrobials. I think it's a good example of collaboration between public and private sector.
Thank you. Next.
Yes. Next question is from Sam T at BMGF. It's for Arshni. Has anyone quantified with reasonable certainty the proportion of non-therapeutic use of antimicrobials in low and middle income countries versus the developed countries?
And you see Ulf and Frank are smiling, and so am I. I mean, this is what we would love to have. And I think in the absence of an actual monitoring system, we simply don't know. And what we do know of this type of usage is based on surveys amongst farmers, them having to recall, as well as at the prescribers of the antibiotics. So unfortunately, from the different surveys, some will say, yes, you see a lot of indiscriminate use, or rather use for growth promotion. And in some other surveys, they will say, maybe it's not that much. But I think it's very unreliable data, and we can't draw a sort of a more general conclusion. I think my personal opinion is that yes, it does exist, probably more than we know of, because we simply don't have the data. The other important thing to note is that farmer, for him, antibiotics are cheap in comparison to some of the other costs that he has. Whether that is a driver then for saying, well, yes, you could use it for growth promotion because you'll have bigger animals, is difficult to say. I don't think we have the actual data, numbers, hard numbers. I wish we did, or we're aiming to get it.
Sure. Thank you. Frank, you have a comment on that?
Yeah, just to complement, saying that we probably also have a problem of definition when we talk about non-therapeutic use, because that includes, as Arshni said, the growth promoters, but also the prophylactic use, and also what we call the metaphylactic use, when you see something happening in some animals and you want to protect those that are not yet affected. And I think that we're missing a sort of global consensus on those definitions. The other thing, back to Sam's question, is that there's not necessarily a split between developing and developed countries when it comes to that. I think even within high-income countries, Sweden and several European countries have banned non-therapeutic use in animals, but other countries are still not there yet. So I think we have still some work to do there.
Thank you. Sandra, over to you. Is there some more?
Yes, but I think Jorge maybe wanted to comment on that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra. Just to following up on Frank's comment now on the definition, I agree that the definition of what's growth promotion, what's therapeutic use is controversial. We do have at the OIE definition, a global standard on this. And the way to split it was veterinary medical use versus non-veterinary medical use. And the non-veterinary medical use is the growth promotion. So under veterinary medical use is treatment, prevention, and control, metaphylaxis. So this is the clear split that we did, and we do the data collection based on this. And regarding growth promotion, in our last report, we have about 40 countries or members that reported still using growth promotion. So this is not, there's a gap between the collection of data, analysis, and reporting. So we did have about 40 countries that reported to us assuming the use of growth promotion. Hopefully these numbers currently are already lower than this.
Thank you. Thank you, George, for jumping in. Sandra, do you have some more?
Yes, I have one question here from Rogerio, who asks, is there any international mechanism to control antibiotic manufacturing? Could be an effective way to control the use. Thank you for all the presentations.
Is there anyone that do have a comment on that? We come back to you, Rogerio. Sorry, or Frank, do you want to say something?
Yeah, maybe just to bring some elements to that, since we've had a focus on West Africa thanks to Marta. I think that what is interesting in West Africa is what the UMOA has done, that is to establish common procedures for products to access the market, and for the first time, the member countries, they have a positive list of products that are authorized, and the member states, they can refer to that list to determine what is a legal use and what is not a legal use. So I think it's an example of international or regional mechanism that helps the countries with that regard.
Okay, thanks, Frank. Sandra, do we have some more?
Yes, there's one more question for Frank here. Could you please, this is from Mahesh Jampani at IVMI. Could you please explain what factors go into calculate the impact scenarios and return on investment for AMR?
Okay, it's a lot of assumptions. Basically, it considers the fact that more people would get sick, that the first course of treatment would likely to fail, course of treatment would be longer, and people would not be able to go to work or run their usual activities. And so those are the factors that are taken into consideration in this model. But we have to recognize that it's based on a lot of assumptions. In fact, the specific impact of specific resistance determinants would be very different, the ones from the others.
Okay, then I thank you, Frank. I take the liberty to pose a final question then to Marta before the break here. You had a lot of educational activities, capacity building between colleagues and animal health professionals in various kinds. Do you see a tension between, let's call it, the traditional medicines and modern pharmaceuticals in preferences among these health professionals?
Mm-hmm.
Or could you comment on that?
Yeah, Thank you for your question. I don't see a tension. I'm just saying that there are some breeders that are more into the natural treatments based on the location as well of their herds. So sometimes it's just the availability of the drugs that is not there. So they are obliged to use the natural treatments, but I don't see any tension. I think that they are both used in a good way, but sometimes the use of traditional drugs is more used than the modern ones.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think for the sake of time, we have to stop here and have a 5-minute break, and we come back and listen to George from OIE and 2 other speakers. So thank you all so much for the panelists, and see you in 5 minutes. And remember to turn off your videos, whatever you do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone, welcome back. We are now waiting for the slides for Jorge Pinot Ferreira. I think they will come in a second. Dr. Ferreira is the deputy head of the Antimicrobial Resistance and Veterinary Products Department at the World Animal Health Organization, OIE. He is a doctor of veterinary medicine, originally from Portugal, with 5 years in clinics. I think that is interesting and important. He has experience from there, and a PhD in population medicine, in combined med school and veterinary school in the US. And he's also a diplomat of the European College of Veterinary Public Health. So please, George, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ulf, and thank you all for attending. More than 100 participants. It's a pleasure to see so much interest. So as Ulf said, I work for the OIE based in Paris, and I'll be mostly focusing my presentation on our data collection efforts. So next slide, please. So for those of you not so familiar, the OIE is the World Organization for Animal Health. It is an intergovernmental organization formed in 1924, even before the United Nations, and the abbreviation comes from the original French name, the Office International des Epizooties. The mandate is to improve animal health, welfare, and veterinary public health, and it sets international standards recognized by the World Trade Organization. So at the headquarters based in Paris, we are about 150, 160 people with different offices and regional representations spread across the world. Next slide. Inside this organization, we have the Antimicrobial Resistance and Veterinary Products Department. So we are about a team of 12 people, of which the head is Elizabeth Erlacher-Windel. I'm the deputy head. And we're about 12 people. It's actually interesting that the department itself is one of the youngest inside the OIE. The work of AMR until about 2 years ago was under a different department. And now the importance of AMR and the commitment to organization is so big that it created its own department. And I'll be focusing mostly on the work, and I wanted to give the credits to them. You see in the top right of the representation there, the three colleagues, Delphi, who is from El Salvador, Morgan, who is French, and Mududutsi, who is from Eswatini, and they are the ones doing the work, direct work on antimicrobial use data collection. And I'd just like to acknowledge and give credits to their work on that. And the other colleagues cover different work streams that I'll be happy to follow up. And in this presentation, I'll be focusing on the antimicrobial use data collection. Next slide. Just a quick note that the data collection is part of the efforts and our strategy on the AMR and prudent use, responsible and prudent use, and don't need to repeat it itself. I think by now most of our audience is familiar with the Global Action Plan, which is supported, was followed or supported by resolutions of the tripartite organizations, and then by strategies of each one of them. So that ours is 4 pillars, which they tend to be relatively similar, which is, I think, logical for the tripartite organization. So the 4 pillars are this one: improve awareness and understanding, the strengthen knowledge through surveillance and research, support good governance and capacity building, and encourage the implementation of international standards. So the antimicrobial use data collection falls under the 2nd pillar of this, to strengthen the knowledge through surveillance and research. Next slide. So about the data collection, next slide. It is done following the standards, and like I was mentioning before, following up on the presentation and comment from Frank, for example, the OIE is something that is very crucial to our work, is the development of these standards. And the standards and guidelines are, the standards in this case, are written in the codes, the terrestrial animal health code and the aquatic animal health code, for the obvious distinction of the 2 groups of animals. So for example, when it comes to the definitions of what it means to treat, to prevent, or control, you will find it in chapter 6.9 of the Terrestrial Animal Health Code, for example. And the data collection that we do, the antimicrobial use data collection that we do, follows what is stated in our standards defined in our code. So all of these are publicly available in our website, and I just wanted to mention them here. Next slide. So this is the core of the result of the antimicrobial use data collection. By now, we published this year the 4th report. So this is the report of the annual global data collection of the different species. And one thing that we always like to emphasize, because honestly we are quite proud of it, is that on each round, and you see that 2015, 16, 17, and 18, we have been having an increasing number of countries or members reporting to us the data, and they are tending to do it in a more granular way. So they can report to us the use data via the most basic option is a qualitative report. So they are just saying, well, we use antimicrobials and which classes. And then there's 3 reporting options, quantitative, and the third is the most detailed one, regarding type of use and the species used, etc. So just to give you an idea that each round of data collection, we have been having an increasing number of member countries, members reporting to us. Next slide. This gives you an idea of how each round of data collection is done. So we published this year the 4th round, the 4th report, which means that the 5th report is now being finalized to be launched early 2021. And at the moment, we are doing the data collection for the 6th round. So it's exactly that, it's a round. So the 4th report was published this year. Early this 2021, it will be the 5th, and then to be followed by the 6th round, obviously. Next slide. And this is, go back a little, just to show the map. This is to emphasize again the global coverage that by now we have of our data collection. And again, emphasizing that it doesn't mean that we have quantitative data across all these countries that you see in the yellow color of the map, but we do have some data from a broad global coverage, I would say. Next slide. So where to find some of the information that I'm telling you? The OI website is now being reformulated, but you'll see it. You can keep moving on the animations. So on the website is the next is you'll find antimicrobial resistant. Next, you'll see next the OI activities, and here, and next there you'll find these templates and the guidance and the annexes to explain how we collect the information, and the template that the countries are using to report to us the use that they do at the national level. So you can feel free to make my presentation public, and then this might help you to find the document that I'm referring to on our website. Next. So for the OIE, I put here, the slide is small, but I put there the link that you can easily find. For us, what comes out of our global conferences is quite significant, or the recommendations of our global conferences. And we organized our last, the second, it was the last global conference of AMR in Morocco in 2018. And one of the recommendations that came out of that conference was that we should further develop our data collection method. So I will follow up now on what we've been doing to implement this recommendation that we received from the attendees of this global conference. Next. One of the things is the development of this tool. So I admire and respect the work of all of my colleagues. The 3 of them that I mentioned in the beginning, I find it quite challenging from the technical point of view, and it is quite challenging to do the report of antimicrobial use from a national level and then to summarize it at the global level. So this is, we felt the need to have an additional tool to help countries to do it, to this conversion obtained in kilograms of active ingredients. So this is a new tool that we have developed to assist countries. Next. That helps us to provide this kind of graphs, graphical representation of the variations on use of the different classes. That's how we report by classes of the different antimicrobials. So this is a new tool that we developed to help countries. Next. The next thing that, and this is a major work that we are doing, is until now we have been collecting this data, the antimicrobial use, via an Excel template. So this might seem too basic or too elementary from some of you, but keep in mind that we have 182 members, and so from some of the members it is very basic and they have their own databases. But for others, having access to a computer or to the field reality that we were referring to before, it is a challenge to have access to Excel, to a computer, to internet, etc. So until now, for the past 4 or 5 rounds, we have been collecting these data via this Excel, and now there's a major investment from our side in the development of this database to collect it not via the Excel template, like an attachment to an email, but via an automatic database. So this is where we are. You can see that we are planning to have it by October in 2021. The process is in full speed, again, following the recommendation from the global conference. Next. These are the 3 phases of this development, database development. You can click on the next. So this is the transition from the spreadsheet to a database. And keep in mind that we also have the YEs, the notification of animal diseases at the YE, and they also have the biomass. When we speak about the use, it's always important to have in mind this is used regarding which amount of biomass of the different animal species. So we have to have the integration and this. And the 3rd phase will be the reporting by species level. At the moment, the basic split that we do is between companion animals and food production animals. And in the food production animals, we don't necessarily specify which food production animal it is, but that's the target of phase 3 of our own data collection. Next. And so this is the overall advantages of this database that we have been developing. We will get a refinement of the information that we receive. Also to keep in mind that the Multi-Partner Trust Fund recently funded this, you have there in the bottom of the slide, this TISA platform. TISA will be a platform displaying information on resistance and use from the different sectors, human, animal, plant, and even the environment and food. So we want our own database to be connected to this future platform that we'll be developing from January on. We want the countries to have less burden to send us the information. We do recognize that at the moment it requires some staff, technical knowledge, etc. And this, at the end, this will lead to country ownership. We hope and we feel that this will lead to the countries feeling that they are empowered by their own data reporting. Next. And to conclude, this is the expecting actions. This was the topic of the whole webinar today and of my presentation. So what are we expecting from members of the different stakeholders involved in this? Well, as much as possible, and we know that we are facing all sorts of different financial struggles at this point, but as much as possible to do capacity building, to be able to do surveillance or monitoring of antimicrobial use in animals. Then the next really important thing is the sharing of antimicrobial use data in a public way. If you are interested in this, at the moment, we at the OIE report by region. So we will not be able to specify how much use is done individual by the country unless the country gives us permission to do it. And in this case, in the reference sectors of this report that I mentioned, our annual report on antimicrobial use, you'll find the link to the national report of that country. So if the country allows us, then the reference is there. And of course, as a public organization, international organization, we do encourage countries to, as much as possible, to keep this trend of sharing their antimicrobial use data in a public way. And then finally, of course, as I mentioned, our core business is the development of the international standards. And our Director General, Dr. Monique Eloy, feels very strongly about the importance of its implementation. Otherwise, it's just a beautiful PDF. So not only we develop them and look forward to the implementation of the standards that we develop. And I think these are the core actions that we are looking for. And the next slide is just to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, George, for this very comprehensive and interesting presentation. And also, I hope that your plea at the end will be listened to, that countries take action according to this. I think it's highly justified demands or requests from your side. Indeed, it's absolutely critical. But we will come back to that later on. So now we have the privilege to introduce Courtney Price. He's a behavioral scientist and risk communication consultant, currently leading the FAO communication and behavior change efforts around AMR. He holds a MSc in behavioral science from London School of Economics and Political Sciences, and a bachelor in liberal arts from Yale in the US. So please, Courtney, the floor is yours. Something happened. Now, yes.
Sincerest apologies, and thank you, Ulf, for that very generous introduction. Thank you, colleagues, for the opportunity to be here with you today and share some thoughts about how about how we're looking at behavior change at FAO and how we as a AMR community might attempt to change the way we do behavior change. The title of my presentation is When Knowledge is Not Enough, and FAO is, of course, a big proponent of trying to increase knowledge and educate, be part of awareness. And this is a core business of the organization. So to be a bit provocative today, I'd like to question that initiative, not from the perspective of education or learning development, but to see if there's any other ways we can more effectively change behaviors around AMR, especially in the livestock sector. So starting out with just a big question, does knowledge drive behavior? Is it something that motivates us to change? Considering the vast amount of publications, regulations, education efforts, trainings that are produced by international, regional, national partners, it would seem that as an AMR community, we think the answer is yes. We all invest a great deal in attempting to increase knowledge, share information. And like I said, FAO is definitely a proponent of this approach, producing a great wealth of publications, advice, documents, guidelines, and more. As a member of the tripartite, FAO contributes to the Global Action Plan on AMR, and a core component of that is education. Translated into FAO's upcoming action plan, there's a focus area on raising awareness and increasing engagement. So, back to the question though, does knowledge drive behavior? To what degree do people make decisions based on what they know? To what degree do we evaluate options, weigh their pros and cons, and make a decision on what's best for us? As economists would say, you know, do we actually maximize utility? And this video perhaps gives us a hint at the answer. Here's some disease experts and health managers from earlier this year passing on their knowledge and explaining to the public what it should or shouldn't do to prevent COVID-19.
Start working on not touching your face, because one main way viruses spread is when you touch your own mouth, nose, or eyes. And of course, enhance cleaning of surfaces.
I've been looking around the room here. I can't tell you the number of you who've put your hands to your face in the last 20 minutes or half an hour.
I want to know how many of them are from...
Don't touch your face. My kids are so sick and tired of me saying if they scratch their face, don't touch your face.
So, why can't these disease experts and officials follow their own advice? It's a difficult question. But studies, you know, if you wonder how often do we touch our face, I just touched my chin. We touch our faces actually, according to various research, 10 to 20 times per hour. It's actually considered probably a complex and semi-autonomous habit. And that's the point. Much of our physical behavior is automatic. So our powers of deduction and our knowledge have a hard time interfering with this very automatic behavior. What about mental processes? Here's a quick experiment. Barbara loves classical music and always has. She is a fan of opera, likes to tour art museums when on holiday. And growing up, she played a lot of chess with family members and friends. Which situation is more likely, do you think? Barbara plays the French horn in a major symphony orchestra, or Barbara is a farmer? Well, if you're like me, the first time I read that, I thought Barbara's probably she's probably a French horn player, but let's check the data. There's approximately 600 million farms in the world. there's less than 2,000 major symphony orchestras. Barbara's probably a farmer. Statistically speaking, she's got a 14% chance, depending on how you calculate, and a very slim chance that she's in an orchestra. Yet our mental processing got to a very quick result based on what we assumed, and it wasn't based on what we know. So once again, is knowledge working here? This is called the representativeness heuristic, where we confound something. We think item A belongs to class B when item A resembles B in some way. And we're going to come back to that with regard to antimicrobials and packaging. So these are some ideas. There's a lot more to it, but let's get into AMR. What does this have to do with AMR? Well, does knowledge drive AMR behaviors? FAO tried to work on that the past year, concluding a large knowledge, attitudes, and practices study implemented by my colleague, Dr. Mark Cowdell, a medical anthropologist. 5 countries, some 900 individuals, and I think above 250 farms, if I'm not mistaken. This study gave these results. Now, these Pearson correlation coefficients show us that something is going on. In all but 1 country, knowledge did not correlate with practices, meaning essentially, the antimicrobial usage and perception of AMR knowledge did not impact at all the behaviors. So increasing knowledge, unlikely to increase behaviors. So what's going on? Well, we can say that there's a disconnect. Knowledge isn't necessarily associated with behavior. Or let's say there's just more complicated things going on. In fact, 2 decades of experimentation, almost 2 decades in behavioral science, shows some interesting inconsistencies. You just experienced some mental shortcuts or heuristics. Additional ones are the availability heuristic, when we tend to think something happens more often just because we've experienced it, like lightning strikes, or perhaps maybe COVID infections. How afraid I am of COVID might depend on how often I think it happens. And if it hasn't happened to me or someone I know, I just imagine it won't happen to me. But that's a shortcut. It's not based on knowledge. Overconfidence is a big one. Representativeness we talked about. Affect, emotion really affects how we decide things. Loss aversion, we feel the pain of loss more than we get excited about future gains. And this is really important when it comes to trying to offer economic incentives. Incentives are extremely important, but they're also tricky. In the global scale, as Frank mentioned, perhaps framing AMR as an investment opportunity at the high level might be an appealing way to look at it. But at the downstream level, at the individual smallholder, economic decisions drive your daily behavior. And if you can't afford to make investments, it's very difficult to get excited about a future gain when all you can think about is your immediate loss. And social norms are extremely powerful. We don't like to be the outlier. We don't like to be the person doing something different. And with AMR, especially in the study we had here in Africa, if most people are doing what the AMR international community considers the wrong thing, it's not very helpful to publicize how everybody's doing the wrong thing. That just motivates more people to stay on the bandwagon. So there's a lot of challenges here, but we can see that this disconnect is something we need to grapple with if we want to try to influence behavior more effectively. So how do we influence behavior? When knowledge is not sufficient, when it's not enough to increase awareness or understanding. What's going on in our brain? Well, not exactly a model of a function or neuroscience model, but a theoretical model that's been very helpful to behavioral scientists the world over has been the system model, dual process model. We have system 1, a very, very persistent but automatic, and Homer, who reacts automatically without thinking, and a very pensive, logical, but lazy and slow Spock, a logical system 2. And these 2 systems, this rational system 2 and this irrational system 1, interact in interesting ways. We experienced it when we looked at Barbara, the farmer or French horn player. There's plenty of more examples where system 1, this automatic system, is a bit faster, takes over and drives automatic behavior. So what do we do about it? Enter behavioral science. In addition to working on knowledge, trying to get system 2 more involved in helping us change behaviors, we shouldn't stop that. but I think we're neglecting system one. Behavioral science is the study of what drives behavior in order to influence it. And in our context, we might add, we hope, to influence behavior for public good. One of the biggest things we can do is try to solicit system one's help a bit more, because system one is so powerful and so automatic, and system two is so slow and lazy. We don't really notice, sometimes that we don't need to know about AMR or even about disease in order to improve behaviors. Just like we don't need to know that cookies are bad for us in order to put them out of reach and out of eyesight, so we don't think of them as often and we don't eat as many. So instead of trying to change minds, why don't we also try to change the environment, the context that drives automatic behaviors? Let's get that automatic system more on board. And finally, behavioral science can run these ideas and create experiments around these hypotheses. That's the science part. It's not just intuitively deciding there are general principles of risk communication or other awareness raising that should or will work. It's getting small representative samples together and testing our ideas to see what works, and then rolling out these behavior change interventions to scale. So behavioral science can offer a lot of method as well as philosophy. Just one example from human health side, Save the Children in Bangladesh created a very, very effective way to increase hand washing of children. They had a lot of other aspects, and there's a lot more things, but in the interest of time, I'll just mention that dramatic increase of hand washing when a foot traffic pattern was created and handprints were painted on a strategically located washing basin. So the question is, how can we translate this idea to livestock? How can we modify context that will make it easier for food chain actors to use antimicrobials responsibly, as well as follow effective disease prevention? What happens when we engage mental accounting and other issues? What about with policymakers upstream? Are people using heuristics? Are they biased against investing in AMR? Are there other ways to influence policymakers as well upstream that would then create infrastructure and opportunities for those downstream? I thought about this a great deal when I was first engaged a year ago in this endeavor with FAO. And the first thing I did realize was that I can't do this alone. None of us can. So I decided we better have a big consultation, get a lot of people together, and then the pandemic hit. So how do we collect insights? How do we approach innovation during a pandemic? Enter the AMR Behavior Change Community of Practice. This is the new initiative that FAO is launching on the 23rd of November. We've had a pilot group of people together so far, and we're focusing primarily on the livestock sector, the poultry sector in Africa, due to existing projects and infrastructure and locations of our field staff. But the goal is much broader, is to look cross-sectoral at how behavioral science can be fused with local knowledge and AMR expertise. We want to see how we can harness this collective intelligence to kickstart the creation of behavior change interventions, especially when field access is compromised due to COVID, and it makes experiments very hard to carry out. So why not engage teams where the people who would be most involved in the change on the ground are in those teams, discussing with behavioral scientists, discussing with AMR experts and food chain actors in order to develop behavior change pilots that just might work. Let me just give you an example of 2 of the pilots that are being developed right now that have come out of this process. There's 6 teams working, and we hope to expand. This is, as many other colleagues mentioned, an agrovet shop, a complex place where decisions get made about which feed to buy, antimicrobials to use, how to solve problems on the farm at low cost. And the agrovet in our studies was revealed to be one of the most, if not the most important source of advice about what to do, not the vet and not disease experts. So in this shop, you have a lot of confounding similarities, and this happens in many shops. As other colleagues mentioned, with access, with the types of labeling and the economic pressures for an agrovet shop as well, expired drugs, counterfeit drugs, and less effective systems make their way into this value chain, and people buy them and use them, and this drives up resistance. These the representative heuristic is at play here. If something looks similar to something else, or if it reminds you of what you used last time and that worked to heal your chickens or solve your problem, you might want to buy it again without actually thinking about what you know about it, without properly reading the label, et cetera, et cetera. And there's plenty more heuristics at play, but what can we do about this, for example? Well, this pilot under one of the group's ideas is, why don't we try to apply all the research and knowledge we know about supermarkets and what drives behavior in shopping situations to an aggregate shop? We know that 60% or more of what we buy at a shop is that which is within close range and within a narrow field of eyesight. Or if you're a child, if you're trying to sell chocolates, it's probably at the eyesight level of a child, so the child prompts the father or mother to purchase that chocolate. What if we tried to approach this differently, saying instead of changing minds, let's change the environment? We could reorganize aggregate shops using these insights to make antimicrobials less likely to be purchased. Perhaps they're higher up, perhaps they're behind a glass shelf, perhaps they're in a part of the less well-lighted area of the supermarket. But if to do that, we would have to have an exchange with the aggregate to perhaps provide more infrastructure, use behavioral science to improve the sales of other more highly marked up goods, and therefore it's a benefit to the aggregate and it's a benefit to trying to reduce AMR. Now, mind you, this is a pilot. This is an idea that's still being developed and we hope to test. But it's very exciting to see how, in addition to knowledge, we can try to change the environment. Another pilot related to the aggregates is, what if the aggregate provided a very timely and accurate reminder about the use of antimicrobials, perhaps when someone goes to buy cholesterol or something else that needs to be reserved for only the most drastic situations. If that communication happens at a behaviorally appropriate time, perhaps it will trigger system 2 to wake up and override system 1, which wants to just buy what it always bought last time. Make it easy. That's the idea behind this. How can we make it easier for people to do the thing that is best for them? Foot baths. No matter where I've been in Africa or in Asia, and I'm sure you, my colleagues and all of you in the audience have experienced much more than I have in the world of smallholder farming or even mid-sized, the default behavior is people step over a disinfection foot bath. They all know why it's there. Not everybody, but the majority knows why it's there. And this behavior could be because people don't want to ruin their nice shoes. It could be just because human beings don't like to get wet. Usually that's a very automatic behavior. How can we make something so automatic? How can we impede that barrier and try to get people to walk over it? Well, maybe it's too hard to convince people. Maybe we just need to make it more difficult for people to step over something. Now, this is extreme, I agree. But the idea behind it is, if you want someone to do something, make it easy. If you don't want them to do it, make it difficult. And if system 1 refuses to relent and let system 2 inform our behavior with knowledge, if you just can't step over it, it's very difficult to enter the poultry house or wherever you want to go without getting your feet disinfected. Of course, there's ramifications for use of disinfectant, too much water use. There's plenty of reasons why this needs to be vetted and understood. But it's an interesting idea, and the concept, I think, rings true. So these are just a couple examples. To close up, sorry, the innovation webinar, which is launching our community of practice officially, starts on the 23rd of November. And you're all very welcome to attend. We hope you might join us. We're looking forward to inviting as many people into this community to discuss the potential for behavioral science to improve communication and awareness raising, to therefore change behaviors for the better. And we'll be working on our pilots and finalizing them as project proposals. And if we are able to secure funding and opportunity, we want to test those pilots using rigorous methods as randomized controlled experiments in the field, and share that knowledge and share that understanding with the broader AMR community to try to build a repository of these ideas so we can continue to innovate on how we change AMR. The final, in closing, we think leveraging behavioral science offers a huge possibility for the way to change how we attempt to change behaviors around AMR in the livestock sector and beyond. And however, we can't, no matter how exciting this is, we can't underestimate the importance of addressing serious constraints. If you want people to wear gumboots, they need to be able to buy them. If you want people to clean their house with clean water and disinfectant, the clean water needs to be, there needs to be infrastructure delivering that clean water. So of course, everything within its context, everything within reason, and combined knowledge, behavioral science, and infrastructural and other improvements in order to enable the behaviors that we want to fight this very important and impending global pandemic of AMR. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Courtney. This is a big dive into our minds, which I think is highly important for really changing things, to be aware of these mechanisms, whether it's Homer or Spoke or someone else that are steering our lives. So, but we will come back to you. Now, thanks. We have Kristina Osbjer from SLU. She has a PhD from SLU as well. She's a Swedish licensed veterinarian, and she had conducted applied research on infectious diseases, especially zoonosis and AMR, in low and middle income countries. And she has been working quite a long time for the FAO as well. And currently she's holding a research associate position at SLU and combining this with a technical consultancy for the FAO. So please, Kristina, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Ulf, and nice to see that there's still over 100 participants remaining. I will try to keep you awake for at least another 20 minutes. So I will talk about some experiences from Asia and Africa working towards responsible antimicrobial use in livestock. I will be talking about both low and middle income countries and with a focus on Asia. Next, please. First, talking a bit about a JPI AMR funded project in northern Thailand, a little bit about profitability versus reducing antibiotic use, a bit about addressing the gaps with capacity building and awareness raising, and some concluding words. Next, please. I've been part of a JPI AMR funded project called Reduce AMU in Thailand, which is an upper middle income country. We've been working in Khon Kaen province in northern Thailand, where we have interviewed and sampled pigs and pig farmers. The picture on the top right can represent one of the small-scale pig farmers that have been part of the interviews and sampling. This farmer gets his treatment advice mainly from his own experience. He uses the drugs that he usually is using, and he sometimes also consults with other farmers. And if he needs more specific advice, he will go to the local drugstore. He has never consulted a veterinarian or an animal health professional. The farmer is always giving antibiotics to newly farrowed sows as a way to prevent disease, a combination of streptomycin, penicillin. And if he treats his animals, and if the first treatment choice doesn't work after 2 to 3 days, he will try another antibiotic. He will normally keep the remains of open bottles at the back of the pens. And he will keep them until they smell bad or they are gasified, and then he will consider them as not useful anymore and will throw them into the normal household garbage. This farmer is keeping 9 sows and 2 boars and has several litters a year, of course. Antibiotics is quite cheap. He's spending about $100 per year on antibiotics. He's vaccinating his pigs regularly. He's spending about $65 a year for the vaccination. But feed is expensive. So on feed, he's spending about $40 or $400 a month. So that is the highest cost that he has on the pig farm. Next. So to the left, you will see an example of an agrovet shop. So most of the small-scale farmers, they will buy the antimicrobial drugs in one of these agrovet shops that sell antimicrobials, fertilizers, and other agricultural equipment. And they give advice mainly to small-scale farmers. since the larger scale farms, and they will normally have a veterinarian that is directly linked to them, and also the larger farms will buy their medicines directly from the medical companies. So when the farmers come in and ask for advice, they will give advice to the farmers based on the story that the farmer tells, the symptoms that are described. All these shops, they require that there is a veterinarian responsible who stands on the certificate, but there is no requirement that the people that are working in the shop, that they have a certificate or any kind of advanced training. So in this specific shop, for example, that you can see in the picture, it was mainly the wife and some high school students that were working and talking to the farmers. And this specific store that you see on the picture, they would normally recommend a combination of penicillin and streptomycin as disease prevention for sows, and rofloxacin for diarrhea in piglets, and oxytetracycline for any coughing symptoms. He was complaining that the very cheap and popular colistin had been out of stock for the past 6 months and didn't know why. We also talked to some of the medium scale farms and company veterinarians working in those farms. In Konkan province, there are 4 different companies that run medium scale farms. So the farms are contracted by these companies. Some of them are multinational companies, so quite large ones that operate in more countries in the area. The farmers, they have to follow the company treatment guidelines. So the veterinarian responsible in the area is also responsible for updating the treatment guidelines. And when we talked to one of the companies, they had very recently updated the treatment guidelines so that they did no longer recommend antibiotics for disease prevention, which was new. Also, they told us that samples were very rarely collected, but they were using kind of previous experience, and samples were only collected when there were very unusual disease signs in the pigs, and if that was seen in many pigs, and they were not part of any larger surveillance program. But recently, one of the companies has started producing green pork that was sold in the local supermarkets at a higher price. And that was pork that was marketed as produced with, without antibiotics, without growth promoters, and without hormones. Then what you would actually do with the pigs if they fall sick, we are not really sure of, because producing pigs without antibiotics might not be ethically the best, because sick pigs would have to be treated. Next. We also collected samples in some of the farms in the area, in total from 51 medium-sized farms and 113 small-scale farms. We collected fecal samples from the pigs, and we also collected fecal samples from one farmer from each farm and one other member of the household. So the farmer is called the contact person and contact human, and the other person in the household is called a non-contact human. And those fecal samples we ran for E. coli and then antibiotic susceptibility testing on that. We didn't detect any difference in resistance if comparing the contact and non-contact humans, which was surprisingly, but we did detect a difference in the resistance found in medium scale and large scale and small scale farms. There was quite high resistance to chloramphenicol, which is much higher in medium scale farms. There was high resistance to trimsulfa, which was also higher in medium scale farms. Interesting resistance to tetracycline, which was also very high, was slightly higher in small scale farms. And if you remember from my previous slide, oxytetracycline was highly recommended to the small scale farmers by the drugstores, and that could possibly explain that figure. Next, please. So to understand a little bit more on the kind of legal framework around antimicrobial use, we pulled together some of the people working in antimicrobial supply in the area in focus group discussions, mixing like small scale, medium scale, large scale farmers, middlemen, drug sellers, veterinarians. And we showed a list of the AMR-related legislation that is available in Thailand, including, for example, the recent ban of antimicrobial use for growth promotion and the ban on colistin use for disease prevention. And when showing that to that group of stakeholders, none of the small-scale farmers or the middleman or the drug sellers, they had seen any of these legislations, whereas all the medium, large-scale farmers and of course, veterinarians, they were aware of them. All the medium and large-scale farmers got the information directly from the company. And everyone agreed that this is a responsibility of the government of DDL to disseminate this information. It's put, for example, on the website. But as you can see at the bottom, there are some difficulties in actually disseminating this information to, for example, middlemen and small-scale farmers due to limited resources, human resources and financial resources to go out and talk to the farmers. And we found that it was quite a complex situation that explained adherence to health guidelines and regulations on antimicrobial use. And the enforcement is particularly difficult, which is also seen by other studies. Next, please. So this study was done in the Sierra countries in Southeast Asia. And they also found that laws were there for very many of the countries, laws prohibiting use of antimicrobials for growth promotion, for example, but to actually enforce those laws is an issue. It's difficult due to some of the remoteness of the farm and due to the high number of farmers operating. Also, this study found that there were some discrepancies between the legal instruments, like the laws that were there, and the policies. They didn't always go hand in hand. Next, please. And we also looked at the profitability in pig farming, and we found that that is the key driver. The farmers were highly susceptible to the changes in pork market price. We found that when the price was low in pork, a lot of farmers, in particular the small-scale farmers, they stopped raising pigs, or they would reduce the number of pigs. And then when the market price was high, they will increase the number, or more farmers will start raising pigs. And that makes investments into small-scale farming difficult if it's done a bit ad hoc or depending on when the price is high. On the bottom right, you see a graph where we asked about the differences over 1 year in 2019 on the pork price. And you see, for example, in blue, the market price. It's higher at the beginning of the year. That is when you have the festive seasons and when the demand for pork is higher, where you have the Chinese New Year and the Thai New Year, for example. Then the price drops during the rainy season when you have a lot of fish, snails and clams available for food, and it goes up again towards the end of the year. Also, the farmers are paid depending on the market price. So in particular, the medium and large scale farms, they are paid very much depending on the market price. Whereas surprisingly, the small scale farmers, that they received a much more stable price since they sell their pigs to middlemen. And then the middleman will not change the price as much over the year, but will keep a much more stable price. As mentioned before, the cost of antibiotics is very small compared to other costs on the farm, for example, feed. We also found, for example, that the large-scale farms, the second highest cost was for biosecurity, for decontamination, cleaning and disinfectant. And other studies in the area, they have also found that the farmers don't always find an economic incentive to reduce the use of antibiotics. One study that was done in Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand, for example, in that study, more than 75% of the farmers found an economic advantage of using antimicrobials because they saw a greater farm profitability and they saw lower mortality rates. So they believed to see that if they used antibiotics, antimicrobials. And if we look at our experience from high-income countries, for example, in reducing antibiotic use by improving biosecurity, improving animal husbandry practices, we might see some difficulties applying that in farms, especially where we don't have as good biosecurity and animal husbandry practices, and where farmers rely very much on antimicrobial use to keep diseases out. Next, please. And that leads us also to some interesting connections that we could see, because when talking to farmers about biosecurity in northern Thailand, many of them said that they had stepped up the biosecurity practices because of the emergence of African swine fever in the region. They were really afraid of getting African swine fever into the farm. And I think we can learn a bit from the experience that has been in the Southeast Asia region over the past 2 years due to the emergence of African swine fever, where we've seen like a high and quick mobilization of animal health professionals in working with African swine fever, development of standard operating procedures, awareness material, but in particular, farmers have really stepped up the biosecurity measures because they are seeing a real threat. Can we somehow communicate to the farmers that also AMR is a real threat that would kind of convince them or make them more likely to improve the biosecurity practices? Next, please.
Christina, could you speed up a little bit?
Yes, please? Yes. I've also worked a little bit with Mozambique, and so moving from Asia to Africa now. And surprisingly there, we saw that academia was not always involved in the national work in implementing the national action plan. That was particular for the human health sector. And I think there is a lot of information, a lot of surveillance done by academia, and also there's expertise in conducting training. So involving academia is crucial, especially in countries where the capacity and the resources are scarce. Also, farmers, we met some farmers in Mazinjiu, and they were trained by the local training centers that are actually reaching a lot of farmers, but there was currently not any training on AMR or antimicrobial use. And we could use them more, the kind of training centers that are meeting and working with a lot of farmers. Also, what differed from Asia was that the access to laboratory consumables and reagents was a huge difficulty because there are no producers of that in South or Southeast African region as compared to, for example, Southeast Asia. Next, please. So when we're talking about capacity building, we need, in addition to collect samples and to have good data, we need to help the low and middle income countries to use that data, analyze it, how to transfer that data into policies, into good treatment guidelines, because there is very much where we've seen that capacity is lacking. Also, I cannot stress enough that any capacity building in low and middle income countries should be sustainable and long-term, and not just ad hoc courses, but really looking at what is the priority of the country, looking at the priorities in the national action plans, and also using TOT, so using a team of trainers, local trainers that can then continue training staff. Next. We are moving into Antibiotic Awareness Week, starting tomorrow, and there will be a lot of awareness events taking place. But we are not as good as measuring the impact of the awareness raising. It's linking to behavior change. It's linking to how knowledge is used for changing practices. And also there, we need to look at the short and the long-term awareness raising and what messages do actually work. Next. This is the final slide. So we are seeing very much that the human health sector is advanced of the animal health sector, and it's usually better financed than the animal health sector, in particular for low and middle income countries. And the human health sector is to a large extent deciding or kind of leading the way forward. And it's important that we, in addition, of course, to working on collaboration with a strong One Health approach, do not forget the animal perspective as well. we have to be able to treat diseases in animals. We have to do surveillance also on those bacteria that do not cause disease or harm for humans, but do cause disease in animals. For modern veterinary medicine and to maintain good animal welfare. And we need to work in collaboration, not only with the farmers and the veterinarians, but also across the antibiotic supply chain and the food industry, involving collaboration with the private sector. Thanks a lot. You can take the next slide. I would like to acknowledge colleagues at the Reduce AMU project, colleagues at FAO, Cambodia, and Region Office for Asia and the Pacific, and colleagues in Mozambique. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christina, for this exhaustive overview. I think it's interesting to see the difference between Southeast Asia and South Africa or East Africa, as yes, different kind of challenges technically. That is very important. I'm leaving the floor to Sandra. You have questions.
Yes, I have at least one question. And this one is for Courtney from Gunilla Eklund. First, thanks for a very informative presentation. Understand fully your concept of changing the environment to promote the improved behavior. But would you also agree that there is a minimum level of knowledge or awareness as basis to build on? And do you have any comment on the level of basic knowledge needed? Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Gunilla, and thank you for raising this point, and thank you, Sandra, for highlighting it. I would say it's a tough question, and the easy answer is it depends. But let's say, like, I was intentionally provocative in my presentation to say we don't need knowledge at all, but obviously I don't really think that. But in the most extreme case, it might be, if not irrelevant, not very interesting to worry about the knowledge baseline. It makes me think of the very first nudge potentially that was created, in which highway center line was painted on roads, especially at dangerous curves when people were in their brand new cars, relatively new invention at the time. They were careening off the cliff because they didn't slow down in time. This curve line, you didn't need to know the length of it, where it was positioned or what it tried to symbolize. You automatically started to curve to turn the wheel. More modern examples are the way that lines in the highway get closer as we need to come to a stopping point where there's lots of traffic. Where I'm from in Chicago, the Lakeshore Drive employs this method a great deal, and people naturally slow down without knowing the distance between the lines or even thinking about them. But I guess you need to know how to drive. You need to know how to use your car. You need to know how to brake. So I think there is a interplay between the two. A funny example that came to mind is also relatively famous behavioral intervention pioneered in the Netherlands, in which in urinals in airports and now almost ubiquitously use in men's toilets a fly or other target. This is I see Ulf laughing, and it's funny, but actually it's a very, very effective nudge that has nothing to do with how much men care or understand that their spillage results in waste, in use of clean water, in use of soap, in expense, in time of labor. They don't know any of that stuff. They just try to hit the target. We had a thought about that in disinfection. What if in your high cages in your poultry farm, you put targets at those hard to reach places to encourage accurate disinfection and spraying or cleaning? This is something that we haven't fully developed in the community of practice, but it's an idea that's floating out there in our discussions. So to be extreme, maybe not, but be honest with you, there's an interplay. And I would say it's less about defining where knowledge stops and automatic behaviors begin, but by attacking behavior change from both sides.
Thank you. I have please, those of you who are curious to pose questions, use the Q&A modality in the Zoom, and Sandra will pick them up. I have a question to you, George. Your very important work in collecting AMU or AMU data, and you're improving the methodology and granularity, as you said yourself. Do you feel, or could you tell whether this kind of actions to collect or ask for data is pushing countries in certain directions, legalize wise, or could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Ulf. No, absolutely, I do think so. It's all the capacity building package, and some of the work very related with that is the training of the veterinary focal points. So we do now, it's online, but usually it's in the regions. We do the trainings, and then it's a chain. Once you raise the awareness of the importance of collecting the use, then it triggers the chain. Oh, so this means that we need properly trained staff, and we need the computers, and we need the internet, and we need the access, and we need to understand. And even more than that, oh, we need to, like someone was saying, the chain of the distribution from the producer of the antimicrobial to the use is very long. So this triggers all the officials in the countries to say, well, we need to track them. We need to understand if it was imported or not, and to trace them. So I do fully support the idea that the fact that this is the end product. The collection of antimicrobial use is the end. You are able to report to us the use, and as you know, sometimes it's not use, it's sales, it's imports, it's whatever. But the fact that you need to have that data means a lot of capacity upstream, and it triggers that. So we do absolutely think and believe, and have some facts on that, it triggers capacity building. It is increasing. So that's good progress.
Thank you. I have one for you, Christina. It's quite interesting how you show the low share of that antibiotics, a very low share of the cost for a farmer, and thereby it's hard to change by economic incentives, if I read you correctly. What is your alternative? What do you think? Freely. You're a scientist, but you can speculate sometimes, perhaps.
Yes, thank you. I mean, if I had the perfect answer, I would be a millionaire almost. No, but I think what we need is that the animal health professionals, veterinarians, that they are paid for preventive animal health advice as well. I mean, that their role that we see very much, for example, in Scandinavian countries, in providing animal disease prevention advice in how you can improve your overall animal farming, husbandry, the biosecurity. That is one important part. It's not only calling a veterinarian when you have a disease problem on your farm and you need the treatment. Another thing is, of course, the widely available antimicrobials over counter. And as long as they're widely available, it's easier. You could put taxes on antibiotics so that they are actually more expensive. But in countries that have quite weak regulatory system in general, and where there's already an influx of a lot of falsified substandard drugs, you always have the danger of drugs getting sourced from other places if the price is really raised by the government. So I don't have the perfect answer, I'm afraid.
No one have. Sandra, are there more in the Q&A, or is it finished?
Yes, I have one more question for Courtney from Ekta Patel. Thank you very much for your presentation. Looking forward to the behavior change community of practice. Can you share how these proposed behavioral changes may be tracked and monitored to see real impact?
Thanks, Ekta, and appreciate your excitement about the webinar, which is really just the beginning. We think that this model of collective intelligence really, especially in COVID times, could produce some great ideas. But those ideas are only exciting if they actually have impact. And as we've seen in plenty of behavioral science and other examples, intuitive examples, or what we think is going to work, doesn't always work. I recall from missions to Benin for brucellosis, where the idea was to offer a vaccination for free. and no one picked it up. Potential reason was that when you offer something for free, someone is skeptical of whether or not it has value. And then the other trick was, if it's too expensive, people think it's unfair. So intuitive examples and ideas aren't always the right approach. We need to test them. And that's where I think we really have a huge opportunity with trying to apply a more rigorous approach to behavior change. We need the global and regional and national awareness raising, but we also need to test our behavior change interventions, whether they're communication based, whether they're rational based, or they're emotional based, or maybe they're just context. Maybe they're about changing the environment. So how to do that really is to start small from a behavioral science approach, that is, designing randomized controlled experiments that attempt to test one or more of the behavioral insights that you have in mind. For example, if we want to look at the foot bath idea of making foot baths just too big to jump over, one of the ideas is to simply observe behavior, actually have observe moments of monitoring the farm where you collect enough data over enough time to see if observable behavior has changed. Of course, you have to be careful that observers do not influence the actual behavior that's going on. Likewise, there's plenty of criticism of self-reporting, but it is a very essential method of gathering data. So understanding through survey methods, people's self-reporting of their behaviors over time is another way to monitor the impact. I think I would reiterate that there's a myriad of ways to take a rigorous approach to these testing methods. And it takes a lot of convincing to get resource partners to invest in a test. We tend to want the answer already. We want to hire the expert that knows already what to do. But in this situation, we need to discover it together. So adding rigorous testing is the way to go. And I would say multiple coordinated rigorous trials are the way to test for impact before rolling out at scale.
Thank you, Courtney, for these wise words. There is no more question, I think. No, Sandra says. As a moderator, I'm supposed to conclude this in one catchy sentence, which is Mission Impossible, as you realize. However, I hope that we now have a more mature or informed perspective on the peculiarities regarding antimicrobials in livestock in low-income countries. And also, I think we have had given a palette of options or path for different kind of, call it interventions or possibilities to change for a better world and for a more rational use of antimicrobials in low-income countries. And again, the presentation will be available at the SLU.se lab, trying to circulate that afterwards. And we will also see if we can put some of the presentations there for you. Saying this, I want to thank you, the panelists, all of you for excellent presentations. We are super impressed by the quality of the presentations. And besides Sandra and myself, there are also 3-4 persons behind the scene. It's I don't know whether they are visible or not. It's Annelie Sonabend, Camilla Lindberg, Agnes, and also Malin Planting, who have been running this. So Sandra and I can relax and focus on you. So thank you all, and have a good evening or night or whatever, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ulf. Bye.